The situation inside Iran is escalating at an alarming pace. Reports now indicate a deepening fracture between the Iranian government and the IRGC after the alleged attack on the UAE. According to emerging claims, the Iranian president openly criticized the IRGC, insisting that the government had neither prior knowledge of nor coordination with the operation. In parallel, the United States has begun deploying an extraordinary volume of military equipment and strategic assets into the UAE, a move widely interpreted as preparation for a potential military response. At the same time, multiple explosions have been reported along Iran's southern coastline, particularly near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically vital maritime corridors in the world. According to Iran International, President Pezeshkian is reportedly furious that the IRGC launched missile and drone strikes against the UAE without informing the civilian government. Sources claim he described the strategy of provoking Gulf neighbors as madness and warned that such actions could trigger irreversible consequences for Iran. If accurate, this would represent one of the clearest indications yet that the IRGC is increasingly operating beyond the effective control of Iran's elected leadership. It is also important to recall that roughly 1 week into the conflict, the Iranian president publicly apologized to Gulf states in a widely circulated video statement. That apology was interpreted by many analysts as an acknowledgement that Tehran understood the dangerous trajectory of the crisis. However, reports later suggested that intense pressure from the IRGC forced him to retract those remarks. The incident exposed what appears to be a widening internal divide, a civilian leadership attempting to contain the crisis diplomatically, while hardline military factions continue pushing toward escalation. The contradictions inside the Iranian system are becoming increasingly visible. Foreign Minister Emirati continues diplomatic negotiations abroad, including meetings in Pakistan, while the IRGC intensifies military posturing around the Strait of Hormuz. President Pezeshkian publicly calls for diplomacy and regional stability, yet senior IRGC figures openly threaten American naval assets in the Gulf. Now, with reports alleging that strikes against Emirati targets were carried out without informing the president himself, concerns are growing that Iran may drift into a broader regional war regardless of what is discussed at the negotiating table. From the IRGC's perspective, however, the situation appears increasingly desperate. Their leadership seemingly believes they must act aggressively to avoid losing strategic control over the Strait of Hormuz. Recent developments have only intensified those fears. Shipping company Maersk reportedly confirmed that one of its vessels successfully crossed the Strait of Hormuz under American naval escort without interference. The operation was part of a broader US-led mission aimed at helping commercial ships trapped inside the Persian Gulf safely return to international waters after weeks of disruption. Some vessels have reportedly remained stranded for more than 60 days, creating severe logistical and humanitarian concerns for crews running low on supplies. This mounting pressure appears to have accelerated Western military involvement in securing maritime routes through the Gulf. The U.S. Navy also confirmed that 2 destroyers, the USS Truxtun and USS Mason, transited the Strait of Hormuz under what officials described as sustained hostile pressure. Backed by fighter aircraft and surveillance assets, the destroyers allegedly faced harassment from Iranian small attack boats, missile launches, and drone activity. According to reports, U.S. forces responded aggressively, neutralizing several Iranian naval threats during the confrontation. Taken together, these events suggest the region may be approaching one of its most dangerous moments in years. The combination of internal instability inside Iran, growing military autonomy within the IRGC, direct confrontations in the Strait of Hormuz, and expanding U.S. military deployments has created an environment where even a single miscalculation could ignite a much larger regional conflict. These developments were further reinforced by a statement from President Trump himself, who addressed the growing tensions surrounding Operation Freedom in a public message. According to his remarks, Iran had allegedly targeted several foreign vessels connected to the maritime security operation, including a South Korean cargo ship. Trump suggested that perhaps it was now time for South Korea to actively join the coalition effort in securing commercial navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. He also claimed that U.S. forces had destroyed 7 Iranian fast boats, referring to the small, high-speed naval craft frequently used by the IRGC in Gulf operations. In his words, these boats represented all they have left. Despite the escalation, Trump emphasized that, aside from the South Korean vessel, commercial traffic moving through the strait had not suffered major damage. The president further announced that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane would hold a press conference the following morning. The expectation surrounding that briefing immediately intensified speculation that far more had occurred behind the scenes than what was being publicly acknowledged. What makes the situation particularly striking is the contrast between events unfolding on the ground and the restrained tone coming from Washington. Reports from multiple media outlets described attacks linked to the UAE, including claims that one of the country's critical oil export ports had caught fire. Yet President Trump's messaging appeared carefully calibrated to minimize the perception of escalation. Most notably, he avoided directly characterizing Iran's actions as a violation of the ceasefire that had reportedly held, at least officially, for nearly 3 weeks. This has triggered growing debate among analysts. Some interpret the administration's cautious language as a sign that sensitive diplomatic negotiations may still be underway behind closed doors. Others believe it could represent strategic messaging designed to avoid provoking an immediate regional spiral while military preparations continue quietly in the background. And those preparations are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Satellite imagery and regional tracking data reportedly show a sharp increase in military traffic flowing into Gulf states, particularly toward American installations throughout the region. The scale of logistical movement has led many observers to conclude that the United States may be repositioning forces and replenishing assets in anticipation of a larger confrontation. Yet publicly, officials continue projecting the image that the situation remains under control. Before discussing those broader military deployments, however, another critical statement emerged from CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper regarding the naval confrontation inside the Strait of Hormuz. According to Cooper, Iranian cruise missiles targeted not only U.S. Navy destroyers, but commercial shipping vessels as well. He stated that American forces successfully defended both military and civilian ships operating in the area. Admiral Cooper further revealed that Iranian drone launches against commercial vessels had also been intercepted. Meanwhile, the swarm of Iranian small attack boats reportedly focused primarily on threatening civilian maritime traffic. According to his account, those boats were ultimately destroyed by U.S. Apache attack helicopters and Seahawk naval helicopters operating alongside the destroyers. If confirmed, these details would indicate that the confrontation in the strait was significantly more intense than initial public statements suggested. Rather than a limited harassment operation, the incident increasingly resembles a direct and coordinated attempt to disrupt international shipping lanes under active U.S. protection. Yet the escalation did not stop there. New reports soon emerged describing multiple explosions across southern Iran, particularly around Qeshm Island and Bandar Abbas, 2 strategically vital locations near the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. Information began circulating through Iranian journalist networks and Telegram channels that continue receiving fragmented updates from inside the country despite severe internet restrictions imposed by the regime. According to messages reportedly received around 4 a.m. local Iranian time, a sequence of explosions was heard across several locations within minutes of each other. Initial reports mentioned blasts in Hormuzgan province, followed by additional explosions near Qeshm, and repeated incidents around Bandar Abbas. The rapid succession of these events strongly suggested a coordinated operation, or a broader military incident unfolding simultaneously across multiple strategic sites. The geographic importance of these locations cannot be overstated. Bandar Abbas serves as one of Iran's most critical naval and logistical hubs, while Qeshm Island occupies a highly sensitive position overlooking maritime access routes through the Strait of Hormuz. Any sustained instability in these areas immediately raises fears of broader disruptions to global energy markets and international shipping. Taken together, the situation now appears far more volatile than official public messaging initially implied. On one side, governments continue speaking the language of restraint and diplomacy. On the other, naval clashes, missile launches, drone attacks, unexplained explosions, and rapid military buildups suggest the region may already be entering a far more dangerous phase behind the scenes. Shortly before reports of the explosions in southern Iran began surfacing, another extraordinary development unfolded across the region: an unprecedented surge in American aerial refueling operations. Large numbers of U.S. refueling tankers were observed departing from military installations throughout the Middle East and moving toward the UAE, the very country that Iran allegedly targeted just one day earlier. And the scale of this movement was anything but routine. According to regional flight tracking data, nearly 40 aerial tankers reportedly departed on Monday alone, with an additional 6 aircraft launching within the first 30 minutes after Tuesday began. Military analysts immediately noted that this level of tanker activity is highly unusual and typically associated with preparations for sustained air operations, long-range strike capability, or the rapid deployment of combat aircraft across multiple theaters. On its own, such activity might not necessarily indicate imminent conflict. Military logistics operations occur regularly throughout the region. However, when viewed alongside Iran's reported attack on the UAE, the explosions near the Strait of Hormuz, and the increasingly aggressive rhetoric emerging from multiple sides, the situation begins to paint a far more alarming picture. The atmosphere of escalation intensified even further after new reports from Israeli media suggested that the United States and Israel were actively discussing retaliatory options against Iran. According to those reports, potential targets under consideration include Iranian missile launch sites and critical energy infrastructure in response to the attacks against the UAE. If true, such operations would represent a dramatic expansion of the conflict. Targeting Iran's missile systems would directly challenge its military deterrence capabilities, while strikes against energy facilities could severely impact the country's already fragile economy. More importantly, attacks on oil infrastructure carry enormous strategic consequences because of Iran's central role in global energy markets and its dependence on hydrocarbon exports. At the same time, the UAE itself appears to be taking the threat environment extremely seriously. Authorities reportedly announced a temporary shift toward online schooling and remote educational programs from May 5 through May 8. While officially precautionary, the timing has fueled speculation that Emirati leadership may be anticipating either additional Iranian attacks or a broader military response unfolding across the Gulf region. Amid all of this, President Trump gave several interviews addressing the broader crisis. Interestingly, he largely avoided discussing the alleged attacks on the UAE directly. Instead, his comments focused heavily on Iran's internal vulnerabilities, particularly its oil infrastructure and economic pressure points. During one exchange, Trump warned about the severe risks facing Iran's energy sector if its oil systems were disrupted. He argued that shutting down underground oil infrastructure could trigger catastrophic damage, including explosions capable of permanently crippling production capacity. According to his remarks, once certain underground pressure systems collapse, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult, with only a fraction of the original output potentially recoverable. He continued by emphasizing reports that Iran may already be approaching a critical storage crisis, claiming the country is running out of available oil storage capacity. Referencing unnamed assessments, Trump suggested that within weeks Iran could face what he described as a natural explosion within its oil system, a cascading infrastructure failure that could inflict long-term economic devastation. These comments were striking for several reasons. First, they signaled that Washington may increasingly view Iran's economic and energy vulnerabilities as leverage points more powerful than direct military confrontation. Second, the language itself carried an unmistakable undertone of warning. Rather than threatening explicit military action, Trump appeared to be suggesting that Iran's own internal pressures, combined with sanctions, conflict, and logistical strain, could push the regime toward a breaking point without a conventional war being formally declared. At the same time, the administration also began discussing what it described as America's red lines in ongoing negotiations with Iran. While details remain limited, the broader message coming from Washington appears increasingly clear. The United States may still publicly support diplomacy, but behind the scenes it is simultaneously preparing for the possibility that negotiations collapse entirely. Taken together, the rapid military buildup, the tanker deployments, the regional security measures inside the UAE, the explosions across southern Iran, and the increasingly sharp rhetoric from Washington and Israeli media all point toward one unavoidable conclusion. The Middle East may be approaching a decisive turning point where diplomacy and open conflict are beginning to overlap simultaneously. At this stage, it increasingly appears that the real negotiations are taking place behind closed doors, far away from the public spotlight. Governments continue issuing carefully crafted statements, but the true scope of what is being discussed likely remains hidden for now. Only when a formal agreement is announced, if one is announced at all, will the world fully understand what concessions, guarantees, and red lines were actually negotiated in the background. And judging by the pace of recent events, many are hoping that moment comes sooner rather than later. During a recent interview, President Trump offered one of the clearest indications yet regarding the administration's position on those negotiations, particularly concerning Iran's nuclear program and missile capabilities. When asked whether recovering Iran's highly enriched uranium was a non-negotiable condition, Trump responded unequivocally, yes. He insisted that the United States wants the material returned, arguing that even if much of Iran's nuclear infrastructure had already been destroyed, Washington still viewed the remaining stockpile as a long-term strategic risk. Trump went on to defend previous military operations against Iranian nuclear facilities, describing them as among the most effective military actions ever conducted. According to his remarks, American aircraft successfully struck underground access shafts during overnight operations with remarkable precision. He repeatedly emphasized the scale of destruction inflicted on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, even suggesting that parts of the program had effectively been reduced to glowing dust. At the same time, however, he acknowledged an important strategic concern: even if the facilities themselves were devastated, the mere existence of highly enriched uranium could still create future risks if the material remained accessible. That, according to Trump, is why the United States insists on regaining control over it. The conversation then shifted toward Iran's missile program, another issue rapidly becoming central to negotiations. Trump indicated that limitations on missile production would also be required, though his wording reflected the broader geopolitical complexity surrounding the issue. He briefly referenced regional comparisons, alluding to the argument often raised by Tehran that other countries in the region possess extensive missile arsenals as well. Nevertheless, Trump's core message remained unchanged: Iran cannot be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. Everything else, missile caps, inspections, uranium recovery, ultimately appears tied to that single strategic objective. The administration's rhetoric also suggests growing distrust toward Tehran's willingness to comply with future agreements. Trump specifically mentioned the need for intrusive inspections, openly admitting that he does not trust the Iranian regime. That statement alone signals how fragile any potential deal may ultimately become, even if negotiations succeed in the short term. But perhaps the most revealing development came not from the White House, but from Capitol Hill. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the strongest political supporters of the confrontation with Iran, publicly floated the idea that the United States should consider supporting anti-regime forces inside the country itself. In his remarks, Graham argued that America does not need boots on the ground because, in his view, millions of Iranians already oppose the regime from within. That statement is highly significant because it revives a narrative that surfaced earlier in the conflict: the possibility of external support being directed toward internal opposition groups inside Iran. Previous reports had already hinted at discussions involving Kurdish networks and potential channels for arming or assisting anti-government protesters. At the time, those reports remained largely speculative. Now, however, prominent American political figures are beginning to discuss such ideas publicly. If this strategy gains momentum, it could mark a major turning point in the nature of the conflict. Up to this point, the confrontation has primarily revolved around sanctions, maritime security, missile exchanges, regional proxy networks, and military deterrence. But support for internal opposition movements would shift the battlefield inward, transforming the crisis from a regional standoff into a direct challenge to the stability of the Iranian regime itself. That possibility likely explains why tensions inside Iran appear to be escalating so rapidly. The leadership in Tehran is no longer dealing solely with external military pressure. It is also confronting growing fears of internal fragmentation, economic collapse, public unrest, and increasing isolation on the world stage. And that may ultimately be the most dangerous phase of all. History has repeatedly shown that governments facing simultaneous external confrontation and internal instability can become unpredictable very quickly. In such moments, even limited incidents, a missile strike, an explosion at a port, a naval clash in the Strait of Hormuz, carry the potential to spiral into far larger consequences than originally intended. For now, diplomacy still appears to exist in parallel with military escalation, but the line separating negotiation from open confrontation is becoming thinner with each passing day. Senator Lindsey Graham went even further in his remarks, arguing that the Iranian people already possess the motivation to challenge the regime, and that the only thing they lack is access to weapons. According to his view, if anti-regime groups inside Iran were armed, they could potentially rise up and destabilize the government from within. He even described it as a kind of Second Amendment solution, suggesting that an armed civilian resistance could dramatically alter the course of the conflict. Those comments immediately intensified speculation about whether parts of the American political establishment are beginning to consider a strategy focused not only on military pressure from the outside, but also regime destabilization from the inside. President Trump was later asked directly about those remarks during an interview, and his response was particularly revealing. Rather than dismissing the idea outright, he acknowledged the argument being made while expressing mixed feelings about the human cost such a scenario could produce. Trump stated that, in his opinion, if ordinary Iranians had access to weapons, many of them would likely resist the regime. He argued that an unarmed civilian population cannot realistically stand against heavily armed security forces equipped with automatic weapons and military infrastructure. Even large demonstrations, he suggested, become vulnerable when one side possesses overwhelming force and the other has none. At the same time, Trump appeared deeply conflicted about the consequences of a potential uprising. He referenced the enormous casualties reportedly suffered during the early stages of the conflict, noting that tens of thousands of people had already died within a short period of time. His comments reflected a broader concern that internal rebellion inside Iran could quickly descend into mass bloodshed and prolonged instability. Still, one of the most striking moments came when Trump hinted that weapons might already be finding their way into the hands of anti-regime groups. While he did not provide details, the implication alone was enough to fuel intense speculation about covert operations, proxy support networks, or informal channels emerging inside Iran. He also claimed that morale within segments of Iran's security apparatus may be deteriorating. According to Trump, some fighters allegedly no longer want to continue the conflict, while others may not even be receiving payment due to the severe damage inflicted on Iran's military and economic systems. Whether those claims are entirely accurate or partly psychological messaging, they reveal how Washington increasingly portrays Iran as a regime under extreme internal and external strain simultaneously. And this broader context is crucial to understanding why Iran's behavior appears so volatile right now. To truly understand the current crisis, however, one must look beyond the immediate headlines and even beyond the 1979 Islamic Revolution itself. The roots of modern Iran's geopolitical posture stretch much further back into history, deep into the 19th century, during the rule of the Qajar dynasty. Many of the structural tensions shaping Iran today were born during that era: the struggle between central authority and regional power, foreign intervention in Iranian affairs, economic dependency, internal political fragmentation, and the deep national trauma associated with outside powers influencing the country's destiny. These historical experiences profoundly shaped the worldview of the modern Iranian state and continue influencing its leadership, military doctrine, and national identity to this day. Understanding that historical continuity is essential because the current conflict is not unfolding in isolation. It is the product of decades, and in many ways centuries, of accumulated political, ideological, and geopolitical pressures. That is precisely why examining Iran's historical trajectory matters so much in this moment. The decisions made by ruling elites generations ago still echo throughout the region today, influencing everything from Iran's relationship with the West to its security strategy in the Gulf, and its determination to resist external pressure at almost any cost. And for anyone seeking to fully grasp how the region arrived at this dangerous crossroads, exploring that deeper historical background becomes not just useful, but necessary.